Everyone knows that blood is thicker than water. Everyone knows that family is your ultimate safety net, the only people on this earth who will stand by you when the rest of the world turns its back. And because everyone knows this, you have been taught since you were a child that walking away from your own blood is the ultimate moral failure. That is the first layer. It is the obvious truth. The problem is that there are 3 layers to this reality, and the third one is the one nobody wants to tell you, because it is the most uncomfortable truth you will ever have to face about the people who share your last name. You are watching this because you made the hardest decision of your life. You walked away. And now, in the silence of that separation, you are asking yourself a terrifying question. Why does God allow the people who are supposed to love and protect me to be the exact ones quietly draining my wealth and my peace? You're wondering if this painful silence after cutting off your family is actually God protecting your destiny, or if you're just fooling yourself into calling your own loneliness a divine separation. You feel like a bad Christian forgoing no contact when everything inside you knows your own family was secretly stealing your future. You feel like you have failed the ultimate test of unconditional love. But what you are experiencing right now, that profound and terrifying isolation, is not a failure. It is the surgical removal of a parasite. It is one drain severed. And to understand how this works, we have to look past the surface of your guilt and examine the architecture of betrayal. But if you look closely, the narrative starts to fracture. That is the first layer peeling back. You start to see that the safety net was actually a web. Years ago, during my field research, I spent extensive time moving between Nsukka and Lagos in Nigeria, documenting social structures and oral histories. I was there to observe ancient traditions, but I ended up documenting a modern tragedy that played out with mathematical precision. In almost every extended family network I observed, there was a universal pattern. The moment one single member of the family managed to elevate themselves, the moment one person broke the cycle of poverty and started building real wealth, the entire family dynamic shifted. They did not celebrate the elevation. They converged on it. I watched as the successful individual became the central pillar, holding up a collapsing roof. Cousins, siblings, and parents would systematically reroute their own responsibilities onto the shoulders of the one who had made it. And it was never presented as extortion. It was always presented as duty. It was presented as love. The successful family member was slowly bled dry, expected to fund businesses that never materialized, pay for emergencies that were entirely preventable, and subsidize a lifestyle they themselves had to sacrifice to achieve. I saw people hollowed out by the very individuals who claimed to love them most. Every time they tried to help their family financially, it felt like pouring money into a bottomless pit. They drained their energy, their peace, and their resources without ever trying to stand on their own 2 feet. And the moment the successful relative tried to set a boundary, the moment they said no, the family turned on them with a viciousness reserved only for enemies. They were called greedy. They were called arrogant. They were told they had forgotten where they came from. This is not just an observation from a field notebook. This is a clinically documented phenomenon. Dr. Karl Pillemer of Cornell University conducted a massive national survey of 1,340 American adults, looking specifically at why families break apart. What he found dismantles the myth of the happy family safety net. He discovered that money, inheritance disputes, and financial entitlement sit at the absolute center of most family estrangements. These are not simple arguments over a borrowed $50. They are symbolic battlegrounds for power and boundary violations. According to his research, approximately 27% of the adult population in the United States is currently living with an active family estrangement. Let that sink in. More than 1 in 4 people are actively severed from a family member. You are not an anomaly. You are part of a massive demographic of people who woke up and realized the cost of unconditional loyalty was their own survival. And the psychological toll of this dynamic is so severe that it has its own clinical diagnosis. Dr. Brad T. Klontz and his colleagues published a landmark study in the Journal of Financial Therapy in 2012. They identified 2 specific psychological disorders that perfectly describe what you survived: financial enabling and financial enmeshment. These are documented conditions where toxic family dynamics force high-earning individuals to chronically subsidize their relatives' dysfunction. It is a system designed to induce emotional burnout and systematic ongoing wealth drain. The people smiling in your face at Thanksgiving dinners were quietly ensuring that you could never build a secure future, because your security meant their free ride was over. What feels like a bottomless pit has a diagnosis. You were never exaggerating. The exhaustion you felt every time your phone rang and you saw their name on the screen was not you being selfish. It was your nervous system warning you that the parasite was hungry again. So, the first layer is gone. You realize it is not a communication issue. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a documented system of financial enmeshment. But wait, that is not the worst part. Because of this, the entire question changes. If the science proves that this dynamic is a parasitic drain, why does religion make you feel so guilty about cutting it off? That brings us to the second layer. When I was in Nsuka, I sat with men and women who had built successful businesses in the city and returned to their villages for the holidays. What I saw was not a joyful family reunion. I watched an interrogation of resources. I saw a successful merchant literally hiding his vehicle a town over, because arriving in a sign of prosperity would immediately trigger a coordinated extraction from aunts, uncles, and cousins. They did not ask how his health was. They presented invoices. They presented expectations. And the emotional manipulation was a masterpiece of social engineering. If he hesitated, if he asked why a fully grown relative could not pay their own debts, the entire room would fall silent. The matriarchs would look at him with a mixture of disappointment and shame, implying that his success was not his own, but a communal asset that he was selfishly hoarding. This is what financial enabling looks like in its purest form. It is not a request for help. It is a demand for subsidy, backed by the threat of excommunication from the family unit. And you know exactly what this feels like. You know the exact sinking feeling in your chest when your phone rings and you see that specific relative calling. You know the script before they even speak the first word. First comes the small talk, the false interest in your life that never quite manages to sound genuine. Then comes the pivot, the manufactured crisis, the emergency that could have been avoided with basic responsibility. But somehow, they need you to solve it immediately. And if you dare to suggest they take responsibility, you are instantly cast as the villain. Dr. Klontz noted in his research that the victims of financial enmeshment often suffer from severe anxiety and depression, precisely because the financial drain is permanently attached to their deepest emotional bonds. The parasite does not just take your money, it takes your emotional bandwidth. It takes your ability to plan for your own future. Every dollar you poured into their dysfunction was a dollar stolen from your own peace of mind, from your own children, from the legacy you were trying to build. And they smiled while they took it. They told you they loved you while they dismantled your foundation brick by brick. The reason you felt like you were going insane before the separation was because you were dealing with a covert operation disguised as unconditional love. They were operating on a business model of extraction, while you were operating on a model of family loyalty. You were bringing a heart to a transaction, and that is the great deception of the first layer. The safety net was never there to catch you if you fell. The net was there to make sure they could catch your resources the moment you rose. You tried to fix it with communication. You tried to sit them down and explain your boundaries. You tried to give them financial advice instead of cash. And how did they react? They did not thank you for the advice. They were insulted because they did not want your wisdom. They did not want to learn how to fish. They wanted to take your fish, complain about how it was cooked, and then demand you catch them another one tomorrow. This is the reality of the people you walked away from. You did not walk away from a loving family that made a few mistakes. You walked away from a highly organized, emotionally manipulative system of resource extraction. You have been told that God commands you to honor your mother and your father. You have been told that family is sacred, and that turning your back on them is turning your back on faith itself. You feel intense guilt because everything around you, society, religion, family, keeps repeating the exact same message even while your own family is quietly sabotaging your financial future. But what if I told you that the church itself recognized the limit of family loyalty 700 years before modern psychology gave it a clinical name? In the year 1274, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest theologians in history, addressed this exact guilt in his masterwork, the Summa Theologiae. He examined the concept of pietas, the sacred honor and duty owed to one's family, and his conclusion dismantles the trap you have been caught in. Aquinas established that the duty of pietas is not absolute. It is conditional. He wrote that the obligation to your family ceases the moment those relations cause spiritual harm, financial extortion, or actively lead you away from your divine purpose and righteous living. The silence that follows walking away from people who were quietly emptying your accounts is not the sound of a broken commandment. It is the sound of a boundary that God Himself demands you set. God cannot elevate a vessel that is constantly leaking from the bottom. And the scripture proves it. If you want to see what family betrayal looks like at its absolute origin, open Genesis chapter 37, verse 28. Joseph was not betrayed by strangers. He was betrayed by his own brothers. The people who shared his blood, the people who were supposed to protect him, sold him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. And why did they do it? They did it because they were driven by envy of his elevation. They saw the coat of many colors. They saw the favor on his life, and instead of celebrating his destiny, they decided to destroy it so they would not have to look at their own inadequacy. For years, Joseph suffered in absolute isolation. He was thrown into a pit. He was sold to foreigners. He was thrown into an Egyptian prison. Total suffocating severance from his family. Imagine the silence he must have felt in that prison cell. Imagine the absolute loneliness. It must have felt like a divine abandonment. It must have felt like God had forgotten him entirely. But that silence was not a punishment. It was the mechanism of his elevation. God had to separate Joseph from the brothers who would have dragged him down in order to position him in the palace where he could eventually save nations. Decades later, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, when the roles had reversed and his brothers stood before him begging for the very wealth they once tried to destroy, Joseph gave the verdict that reframes the entire ordeal. He looked at the family that had betrayed him and said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done." The isolation that followed his betrayal was never abandonment. It was engineered in reverse. God removes the parasite to save the host. And this is where the reality gets even darker, because the betrayal does not always look like being thrown into a pit in the desert. Sometimes it looks like a business contract signed across a kitchen table. Consider the case of the comedian Dane Cook. At the height of his career, he was one of the most successful entertainers on the planet. And when it came time to manage his immense wealth, he did exactly what society tells you to do. He kept it in the family. He appointed his own half-brother, Daryl Macaulay, as his personal business manager. He gave him unrestricted access to his financial accounts. He trusted him completely. because they shared blood. Over the course of roughly 4 years, that unconditional trust cost him an estimated $12 million. His own brother secretly embezzled tens of millions from his personal and business accounts, draining his life's work one transaction at a time. The brother even wrote himself a single check for $3 million. Dane Cook did not find out through a tearful confession at a family dinner. He found out in the numbers when the accounts were drained and nothing added up anymore. He was forced to sever all family ties permanently and prosecute his own brother through the courts. Cook later described the period following the discovery as a devastating isolation. Everyone had warned him that prosecuting family would destroy him, but that isolation ultimately became the necessary rupture that protected the remainder of his financial life and secured his future. Here is the detail people skip. If the people closest to you have never once needed anything from you except access to what you build, tell me honestly, at what number did you finally see it? How much did they have to take before you realized the safety net was actually a siphon, so the second layer is gone? You realize that your guilt is a manipulation, and that isolation is historically and biblically the exact method God uses to protect the chosen from the envious. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. When Thomas Aquinas wrote that the duty of pietas ceases in the face of spiritual harm or financial extortion, he was doing something revolutionary. He was taking the weapon of religious guilt out of the hands of the abuser. You have to understand the magnitude of this. A doctor of the church writing in the 13th century explicitly stated that God does not require you to set yourself on fire just to keep your relatives warm. The conditional nature of family duty is not a modern psychological invention. It is an ancient theological truth. If a relationship actively degrades your ability to fulfill the purpose God placed on your life, it ceases to be a sacred bond and becomes a spiritual stumbling block. You cannot build a legacy that honors God if you are constantly pouring your resources into a foundation of dysfunction. Aquinas recognized that sometimes the most righteous thing you can do is walk away. And look again at Joseph. 20 pieces of silver. That was the price tag his brothers put on his life. When they stripped him of his coat and threw him into that pit, they were not just trying to get rid of a sibling. They were trying to assassinate his destiny. They looked at the favor on his life and felt entirely entitled to destroy it because it made them feel small. Think about the years Joseph spent in Egypt before he ascended to power. Think about the absolute silence from his family. No letters, no visits, no apologies. For over a decade, he lived with the knowledge that the people whose blood ran in his veins had traded his life for the equivalent of a few months' wages. The isolation must have been crushing. It must have felt like a permanent curse, but God was operating in the silence. God knew that if Joseph had stayed in that toxic family structure, he would have spent his entire life shrinking himself to make his brothers comfortable. He would have spent his life subsidizing their mediocrity. God had to forcefully remove him from the parasitic environment so he could develop the administrative and spiritual capacity required to run an empire. The isolation was the classroom. The severance was the graduation. This brings a terrifying clarity to the modern examples we see, like the devastating betrayal of Dane Cook. When you look at the mechanics of what his half-brother Daryl Macaulay did, you see the exact same envy that drove Joseph's brothers. Macaulay did not just steal $12 million, he stole it slowly. He stole it methodically. He watched his brother work to the point of exhaustion, performing in arenas, building an empire from nothing, and he simply diverted the lifeblood of that empire into his own pockets. He wrote a single check for $3 million to himself. Imagine the breathtaking entitlement required to do that. Imagine looking at your own brother, the person who trusted you enough to give you the keys to everything he built, and deciding that you have a fundamental right to take it from him. This is the psychological rot at the core of financial enmeshment. It is not just theft. It is the absolute destruction of trust. When Cook finally discovered the truth, he did not seek mediation. He did not try to keep the peace for the sake of the family name. He sent his brother to prison. He chose the isolation. He chose the devastating silence of a fractured family over the comfortable lie of a parasitic one. Because at a certain point, you have to choose between your destiny and their comfort. You cannot have both. If you stay, they will drain you until there is nothing left but resentment and an empty bank account. If you leave, you have to face the silence. But the silence is the only place where God can begin to rebuild what they tried to destroy. This brings us to the third layer, the nucleus. The truth that nobody wants to hear, because it shatters the very foundation of how we are told to operate in the world. Go back for a second to that phrase from the beginning. Wait, no Portuguese allowed. Go back for a second to that phrase from the beginning. Everyone knows that blood is thicker than water. That was the obvious answer. Anyone would arrive there. But you know now what that phrase was hiding. Because the people who used it against you, the people who weaponized it to keep you tethered to their dysfunction, they only told you half of the proverb. The original, complete phrase is not about biological loyalty at all. The original phrase is, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." Read that again. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means the exact opposite of what you were taught. It means that the bonds of honor, commitment, and shared integrity that you choose in your life supersede the biological ties you were simply born into. The modern truncated version of that proverb was invented to invert the truth entirely. Blood is thicker than water was the version that was convenient for them. It was the version that allowed them to drain your resources while demanding your absolute loyalty. When you understand that, the third layer changes the frame completely. You realize that saying God removed your family is not just a convenient spiritual excuse to justify bad communication or abandon your obligations. It is a documented self-preservation response to chronic financial abuse and boundary violation. The spiritual framing simply adds meaning to what behavioral science already confirms independently. And that is why you're where you are right now. The fourth layer is the one you are living today. You felt intense guilt because you thought the isolation meant you were broken. You thought the silence of having no family to call meant that God was punishing you for walking away. You thought that feeling isolated after cutting them off was a sign of clinical depression and moral failure. But psychological research on voluntary solitude and recovery from coercive financial relationships confirms the exact opposite. The research shows that the initial phase of separation actually reduces cortisol levels. It breaks the cycle of codependency. It initiates your cognitive and emotional recalibration. The discomfort you are feeling right now is not the destination. It is phase 1 of recovery. Calling it depression conflates the difficult transition of healing with the disease itself. The silence is not God abandoning you. The silence is the sound of the drain being severed. They were secretly stealing from your accounts, manipulating your inheritance, and smiling to your face while pretending to love and support you all along. They did not love you. They loved the access to you. And God, in His infinite mercy, saw that the only way to save your future was to amputate the attachment. When you first made the break, the silence in your house was probably deafening. It felt heavy. It felt like the physical manifestation of failure. Every holiday that passed without a phone call felt like a fresh wound. You lay awake at night wondering if you were the monster they told everyone you were. But then, something strange started to happen. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the baseline anxiety in your body began to drop. The chronic tightness in your chest, the one that always flared up when your phone rang, started to disappear. You realized you were no longer bracing for impact every time you checked your bank account. You realized you could actually plan a vacation, or make an investment, or simply buy something nice for yourself without the suffocating guilt that you should be sending that money to someone else. This is the cognitive recalibration that the research talks about. As your cortisol levels dropped, the fog began to clear. You started to see the relationship not for what you wished it was, but for what it actually was. You recognized that the codependency cycle had been broken, and for the first time in your adult life, you were entirely responsible only for yourself. That is the true meaning of the severed drain. It is not just about keeping your money. It is about recovering your energy, your focus, and your divine alignment. The people who were secretly stealing your wealth were also stealing the mental bandwidth God needed you to use to fulfill your purpose. They were keeping you distracted. They were keeping you exhausted. They were keeping you small. By removing them, God did not just protect your finances. He protected your future. He cleared the space necessary for you to finally step into the elevation He had planned for you all along. The isolation was the sterile environment required for the surgery. The silence was the anesthesia. So stop calling your deliverance a depression. Stop calling your boundary a betrayal. Stop looking back at the Egypt that enslaved you just because you occasionally miss the familiarity of the chains. The people who were meant to journey with you into the next season of your life will not require you to bleed yourself dry just to prove you love them. The blood of the covenant will bring you the family you deserve. A family built on mutual respect, shared integrity, and absolute honor. Until then, stand firm in the silence. It is the evidence of your rescue. The isolation wasn't your punishment. It was your protection. If you made it this far and this kind of investigation resonates with you, it is worth subscribing. The algorithm only shows the next layers to those who signal they want to see more. And in the upcoming videos, the revelations get even more uncomfortable. Tell me in the comments below, at what exact moment did you finally realize that the people you were trying to save were actually the ones pulling you under?